Apologise for the delay. Thanks very much, ma'am.
Thank you. Well, this is how does the government respond to a disaster? That's my talk today, and I feel like today has been a bit of a disaster, starting from waking up this morning and being told my flight here was cancelled. So, but I'm here. So I'm here. So if I'm the government, I've responded well.
Ma'am, perhaps you can tell them what seat you actually had to travel in.
I actually sat in a seat that said flight attendant only. And in fact, at one point, the flight attendant came and removed it because he said he didn't want people asking me questions. So I'm here to talk about not fantastically cool capability. I won't show you aircraft. I won't show you ships. And if you want to leave now, I'll give you an out-and-out warning right now. I will show you organisational charts. I will explain about committees. And if that sounds really dull, doors at the back. But it is how it all gets put together. And in my day job in the Office of Health Protection in the Department of Health, I have a unique opportunity to see how that works and how it gets put together. And a lot of people don't know how that happens, and it's probably a bit of a mystery to you. Most of the time you add water and the ADF turn up, or an NGO turns up, or indeed how does it actually happen? Well, disasters come in all shapes and forms, and the disaster response that usually happens uses an all-hazards approach, meaning we pretty much do the same sort of things for every single disaster, but with slight variations on a theme depending on what's required. So I thought I'd start, because we're in Queensland, to talk about what happens at the state level, right down from a hospital, and I'm sure we all work in hospitals that have some sort of disaster plan. That links into, in Queensland, the HHS mass casualty plans, the state plans, which in turn link into the whole of Queensland Health Plan, then into something called Odds Trauma Plan, which is the national plan to respond to disasters. Now, this is a chart of the Queensland State Disaster Coordination System. Now, all of these charts end up looking very similar. They all have either, depending if you're a state or the Commonwealth, the state at the bottom, the Commonwealth at the top, but this is a state chart, so the Commonwealth's at the bottom. And you can see what happens is you have a group that's managed at the state level by the Premier and a Cabinet, then it comes down to a management committee. The management committee has a coordination centre, and they always have plans. And you'll see as I talk that everyone has committees or groups, coordination centres and plans, and that's how it's all fitted together, or fit together rather. So why do we have it this way? Why don't we just have one system? Well, that's because we're a federated nation. And as a federated nation, the Constitution describes what the Australian government is responsible for and what states and territories are responsible for. Health is the constitutional responsibility of the states. For the Commonwealth, our job is a coordination role. We're there to assist where we can, but our job isn't providing health. That's a state's constitutional role. Now, security challenges, you think that must be the Australian government. Well, yeah, absolutely it is, but not all security challenges are big national ones. Sometimes they're more local and state-based ones. So the Australian government assists the states and territories with security challenges that transcend their responsibilities. And that can include border security, making sure the society is resilient, and protecting Australia and their interests in home and abroad. So you can see this is showing you the health responsibilities, what's the Commonwealth responsible for, what are states, and that is a complex web of coordination, agreement and collaboration on a daily basis. So I work with other government departments who say, OK, we're just going to go and do X, and they tell the people who work for them and it all happens. Whereas we have to say, wouldn't it be a really good idea if we all do X and we do it the same way and we do it at the same time, what do you think? And we seek collaboration from all states and territories to agree. So, as I said, you need plans. Everyone's got arrangements. These are the National Australian Emergency Arrangements. And these arrangements spell out responsibilities for support to the states and territories and the way that they manage emergencies and disasters. how we do coordination, how to provide assistance when asked, and this is sort of the overarching document. This is all freely available on the web. Now, as I said before, remember there's always committees, there's always plans. These are national plans, and you can tell that because they've all got plan in the title. And some of them are used a lot. ComDis plan is used probably the most commonly, and that's how do we respond to requests for assistance from state and territories to help with disasters. And that spells out how you ask for help from a jurisdictional sense, what sort of help's provided, who pays, always exceedingly important to understand who's paying for what, and that plan, as I said, gets used quite a bit. Others less often, and I don't think I've ever seen the AusPred plan for space re-entry debris plan, but I'm sure it's there in case it's needed. And perhaps my Air Force colleagues could tell me when that's been used, but not in my time. So, as I said, it's an all-hazards approach. And it depends on the type of disaster, if we're responding to a disaster or responding to an outbreak of an infectious disease. But depending how big it is, the Commonwealth Government, the National Security Committee of Cabinet will meet, the National Crisis Committee, there's a National Counter-Terrorism Committee, and what I've talked about before, the National Emergency Management Committee. Now, here's an org chart. I promised you org charts, but this is in fact how it sort of shows you how you link up what's happening at the state level with what happens at the national level, and potentially how that links internationally. So you can see, if I could press on this, you have the state and territory making decisions, they've got their national committee, their state committees. If it's a health issue, that will come down to the State Health Department. Over here, we have the National Security Council, it's a Prime Ministerial Task Force that links to the Australian Government Crisis Committee, who would link to its own agencies for a health issue, it's Department of Health. Then in the middle, we have the linking committees, which is the National Crisis Committee at this level, and for health, we have something called the Australian Health Protection Principal Committee, and that joins up what's happening in the state with what's happening at the Commonwealth. And of course, we've all got rooms. There's the Australian Government Crisis Coordination Centre, commonly known as the ACCC, and the National Incident Room, which unfortunately I'm all too familiar with. This is sort of just magnifying that up a little bit. The Australian Health Protection Committee has its room, the National Incident Room, and state and health authorities have the same thing. They all have, I think in Queensland it's called the SHEC, the State Health Emergency Coordination Centre, and you can see they are linking to all the different types of services that exist in Queensland. For the National Incident Room, it has a dual role. It's also the national focal point for international health regulations. So, for instance, when there's an infectious disease or an outbreak of a communicable disease that could threaten trade or can spread overseas, we are required under the international health regulations to notify another country. So we notify the WHO and other focal points in other countries. So, what's the first thing that happens? We have an IDETF, the Interdepartmental Emergency Task Force, and that really meets very quickly anytime there's any kind of disaster, and that will pull in all of the different departments within the government. They all come together. Defence is always there to say what's the situation, what's happening, who can do what, what's required. And from the IDETF, there's actual taskings go out from that, so that we actually pull that together and understand what all parts of government are doing. For instance, for Ebola, that involved DFAT, Health, Defence, Emergency Management Australia, Treasury, Agriculture, Police, AFP, Social Services, Immigration, Customs, PM&C. That seems a lot, but all those parts have to come together and work as a coordinated whole. So, remember, we had Australian emergency management arrangements. We also have national health emergency response arrangements. And this actually gets used quite a lot. This is when we decide from a health perspective when do we need to use these arrangements. Well, you use them when you've got something that threatens to impact two or more states or territories or cross-jurisdictional borders, so it's going for more than just one state. It might overwhelm or exhaust a state, and a state may anticipate that's happening. For instance, during the Queensland floods, Queensland, of course, were managing it, but they could see these were really big, massive floods and they might need assistance from other jurisdictions. and that's sort of the scale and complexity can warrant a nationally coordinated response. If you think of something like a pandemic, obviously it's never going to affect one jurisdiction and nowhere else. It often quickly spreads and a national response is required. And it's used to coordinate that national health sector response. The Australian Health Protection Principal Committee is the principal committee for doing this, and you think, oh, that's a bit of a mouthful. It's made up of the Chief Health Officers from all the states and territories, Defence, Emergency Management Australia, Ambulance, our Communicable Disease Control Committees, our Public Health Lab committees. They all have representatives who come to this meeting. So a health problem exists. They will meet by teleconference within an hour at times to sit down and say, okay, what health assets and resources can we bring to support this particular event? Remembering you have arrangements and then you have plans. So these are the plans that come underneath the National Health and Emergency Response Arrangements. There's Oz Trauma Plan, which is all about what to do when it's a physical disaster. There's a CBRN plan for chemical, biological, radiological and nuclear incidents of national consequence. There's the Emergency Response Plan for Communicable Diseases, the CD plan, and that outlines how we respond to communicable diseases. There are sub-plans underneath that which are more specific. The first plan, I'd have to say, is probably the pandemic plan, and that's been rewritten several times. After you learn the lessons of each pandemic or each time you try it out, you realise you should have done it a little bit differently, and that's really that's really what happens to every single plan that's ever written, is once you start to use it, you realise you actually wanted to change it slightly to make it better for next time. So the burn injury annex came about because after Bali there was obviously lots of people who had suffered burns, and it was how do we actually manage a number of people with burns and have them treated across the country in a way that uses those resources most effectively. And of course there's special guidelines for things like smallpox and anthrax. Now the National Incident Room, the room that Health has, is activated on many occasions. It's physically a room. It brings everybody in together to help do that coordination piece. These are some of the events that it's been activated for. The National Incident Room doesn't have to be used for national coordination to occur. It can still occur without that. So you'll see that some more recent things aren't there, but it certainly gets used for all these things. The one that's a particular... Oh, what have I done? Let me go back. Oh, I'm back. I'll press the right button. CF36 is probably a really good example of how it all comes together. That was a suspected illegal entry vessel that had a number of people who were in the boat, and there was an explosion on the boat. They were being towed at the time by an Australian naval vessel. There was injured sailors who'd been on that vessel at the time. A number of people on the boat were injured, a number of burns. The patrol boat team did a fantastic job. There was a doctor on board and a whole lot of non-medical staff, and they managed to resuscitate something like 36 people, keep them alive, keep them going, got them to an oil tender off the northwest of Australia till that they were medically evacuated to a bare airstrip in the northwest of Australia, and from there resources came in, and that was coordinated through the states and territories, through Defence, to get people in the middle of the ocean somewhere to a platform, to an airstrip, then distributed around Australia to have their burns treated and their injuries treated. And that really shows you how something like that can happen. That happened real time. That's something, one of those occasions when AHPPC meet within an hour, decide what's required, and it all starts to fold out from there. And this is a picture of media response. Now, managing the media is actually really important, and is also a national coordination piece that we do. There's something called the National Health Emergency Media Response Network, which is made up of media representatives from different departments, both Commonwealth and jurisdictional, and they basically have to ideally make sure that we're sending out similar messages at the same time. It's never helpful in a disaster or an outbreak situation to have different messages and different timing. So what they do is actually get together and help us coordinate those messages. And I only show you this because you can sort of see the amount of interest the media pay in something can be quite disproportionate to the actual threat. If you think about it, in that instance, I think in the US they had 4 people who, with Ebola, actually on US soil, and 1 person actually died. But the anxiety produced is enormous, whereas some other things are far less, or actually more of a threat, don't really rate it so much in the media. So it's just understanding what people are interested in, understanding what sort of messages are the important messages to send out, and as I say, the most important piece is to say it at the same time. Now, one of the enablers for the Australian Health Protection Principal Committee is, and the National Health Emergency Response Arrangements, is the National Critical Care and Trauma Response Centre in Darwin, which was set up after 2002, after Bali, and it's located in Darwin, and it's a place where they bring together they've got teams of people, they train people to respond. I know you were asking what else could you do. Well, the NCCTRC run training courses, run exercises, do research, are particularly interested in how do we provide those sort of responses. They've got a big cache of equipment to support any deployment offshore. And they train the Australian medical assistance teams. And these are civilian teams, so they're made up of specialists and whoever from around Australia. There's a state response, and it's the state AUSMATs, and then there's a national AUSMAT. And often the national AUSMAT will have people from different states coming into it to join it. And they may go overseas. They've certainly done some of the more recent disasters in our region. And they, as I said, they've got a suite of equipment. They don't have heavy lift. They usually would rely on the ADF to get them to where they're going. But once they're there, they've got a whole range of skill sets that they've got, and they've trained regularly. And they're sort of in between the military, in between an NGO, but people who do this are well trained to go and do it. Oh, one thing about the AUSMATs as well, they've just been accredited by the World Health Organisation as a Type 2 emergency medical team, and the WHO have decided they really need to accredit some of the teams that go to help in disasters, because at times a country can be overwhelmed by all the people rushing in to help, some of whom, rather than being a help, are an absolute hindrance and aren't appropriately trained and equipped to provide any level of support in that setting. So this process of accreditation is one where countries, if they've got a team, they have to show that when they turn up, they'll be useful. And this is part of it. And I think there's only 5 or 6 that are accredited so far in the world. So when's the ADF involved? Well, as I remember, when there was an IDETF, the Interdepartmental Emergency Task Force, the Defence is at the table, and the whole of Defence response is led by CDF. If there's health aspects, it's supported by the Commander of Joint Health Command, and the planning for what the ADF would be able to provide and do is done in the Headquarters Joint Operations Command. They basically say, disasters occurring, what is the range of options and capabilities that Defence could provide should they be asked to do so in this setting. So it really means that when they have the meetings and they say, what can Defence provide, they actually understand what's available now and where it could fit. So things that Defence does particularly well, and everybody's demonstrated that today, is strategic airlift, availability of maritime assets, and of course some health assets. So who decides who goes? Well, it is a government decision. The Australian government decides who goes, and they have to take into account a whole lot of factors. It's where it is it in our region, is it much further afield, the logistics of supply and how you're going to get it there, what's the security setting on the ground, is it a somewhat hostile environment, or is it one where it's really a disaster and everybody's very pleased to have you there. Of course, governments will always consider influence and strategic policy. Very, very importantly, you can't just turn up in a country and say, we're here to help. You have to be invited in. And so without an invitation, the Australian government doesn't send anybody. And some countries are more comfortable with the military response. Other countries are much less comfortable with military response. So we're guided by what that country requests. And of course, we have to always consider the safety of the people who are going to do this, and that's related to its location. And obviously, if it's an international disaster, understanding who else is going, how we might complement resources provided by other countries, and particularly our allies. So, in any disaster, the government will be responding, and it is coordinated. It might not, as I say, it might not be clear to everybody exactly how it happens, but it is highly coordinated. There's lots and lots of cross-representation on different groups, so people do understand what's happening. All the planning, all the committees, all the diagrams just help people to understand what their job is and whose responsibility it is to do what. And remember, the government decides who goes where. So that's all I had today, and I'm happy to take any questions if people have got any other particular concerns.